In this chapter, I'm going to take you through the basics of formatting text on your web pages. And many of these formatting techniques I'm going to show you make use of an HTML tag called the font tag. Now, I had kind of a hard time deciding whether to include this chapter or not, because we're kind of at a weird time right now in terms of typography on the web. As I mentioned early in the background chapter, there's been a strong movement in recent years to separate the structure of a web page from its presentation. Now, if you need a quick refresher on the difference between structure and presentation, go back and watch the movie that introduces the term CSS in the background chapter at the beginning of this tutorial. But the gist of it is that current web standards emphasize the use of cascading style sheets to format the text on your page, rather than the use of the font tag. The font tag is an HTML tag that's used to format text size, color, and font face. And it served its purpose in the early days of the web, but when HTML version 4.01 came out, the font tag was officially deprecated by the World Wide Web Consortium. Again, it's that standards committee that determines web standards. And that means that the use of the font tag was to be discontinued in favor of a more flexible formatting method, namely cascading style sheets. So after mulling this over, I decided to keep this chapter in here and show you how to format text with the font tag, even though the tag has been deprecated. Because the font tag is still largely supported in most current browsers, and it's still used by a lot of web designers. Also, there may come a time when you'll need to work with an old website that uses regular HTML formatting instead of CSS. So think of most of the movies in this chapter as glimpses back into how things were done a few years ago. After we finish this chapter, we're going to start looking at CSS, and you'll see how you should be doing things from now on. But there's still a lot of good information and useful tips in this chapter, so if you're not familiar with this way of formatting text, try to resist the urge to skip ahead. This chapter is sort of an intermediate step towards building better typography skills in web design. A lot of the information that you're going to learn here is pretty similar to what you're going to learn in the CSS chapter. And again, if you are going to work with older websites or even with the current websites, you're probably pretty likely still to run across the font tag as you revise and work with these websites. So it's, again, a good idea to familiarize yourself with this particular way of formatting your text. So let me start off by giving you an example of the difference between the HTML font tag formatting and CSS formatting. I just whipped up a quick example file here of a single sentence. Let me just expand these here. That has some formatting applied to it. I've got a version that uses the font tag and a version that uses CSS. Here in Design View, they pretty much look identical. I don't think you're seeing any kind of difference between these two bits of text as I switch back and forth between them. But we are actually looking at two different versions of the same exact sentence. So in Design View, they look pretty much the same. But let's switch over and look at the source code. I'm going to use the split view so we can see both Design View and the code at once. I'm just going to raise this border up a little bit here. Okay, so first of all, in Design View here, we can see that the word T-Cloud is a little bigger than the rest of the text on the page. And if you look down in the source code, you can see here that it's been formatted with the font tag. This font tag here has a size attribute of 5. Again, in case you're not too familiar with HTML, just about everything in HTML is formatted with an opening and a closing tag. This is the opening font tag, and this is the closing font tag. You can tell a closing tag by the slash in front of the tag's name. So everything that appears between the opening and closing tags is formatted by those tags. So you can see here that the word T-Cloud appears between the opening and closing font tag, so it's the only word that appears at this particular size. The information that follows the tag's name is known as the tag's attribute. So in this case, the font tag has a size attribute, and the size equals 5, which is the size that we're looking at right here. The next bit of formatted text we have up here in the Design View is William and Hillary Rourke in this reddish color. Again, this text was formatted with the font tag, so if I highlight up here, I'll see it down here. This time the font tag has an attribute of color, and the color has a hexadecimal value of 990000. A hexadecimal value is just a mathematical way of expressing a color value. And lastly, we have the phrase staggering paucity in a different font than the rest of the sentence. And again, it's been formatted with the font tag. And here is the attribute face, and it's indicating that this particular font should be in Verdana. So this is standard HTML font formatting. And when you think about it, this is really an inefficient way to format text on a web page. Because every time you need to make something a size of 5, you've got to put font tags around it. Every time you need to format some text color, you have to put font tags around it. Every time you want to change the font face of a piece of text, you have to put font tags around it. There's no way for one set of font tags to share information with another set of font tags or to be tied into another set of font tags. Each bit of formatting needs its own set of font tags, and all those font tags and their attributes can really start to add up and just make your page bloated with HTML code. Now let's take a look at the same text formatted with cascading style sheets. First of all, let me go into split view here. Actually, let me go into code view and look at these two pages. Now, first of all, switching between these two, it initially looks like that the CSS version has more code. It's got 22 lines of code, and the HTML example has 15 lines of code. So, in fact, the HTML code is actually shorter in this example. But it's what the CSS version is setting up that makes it so appealing in the long run. See this chunk of code right here between the style tags? This is this page's internal style sheet. Now, I'll be getting more into this in the next chapter, but for now I just want to get across that this is the bit of code that describes the styles used for the entire page. Style 3 here specifies a font size of 24 pixels, Style 4 specifies a particular color, and Style 5 specifies a font face. Now, to use these styles, all you need to do is use what's called a span tag. See this tag right here called span? It's got an attribute of class, and that class equals style 3. So when the browser sees this, it says, okay, style 3 says I should display everything after this tag at a size of 24 pixels. And sure enough, it does when I go back to my split view. There it is. This span tag here has the attribute of class equals style 4, and again, style 4 specifies a color. And this span tag has an attribute of class 5, and that specifies the font. Now, at first glance, this really doesn't seem any more efficient than using the font tag, but the strength of style sheets is that you can apply the same style to as many chunks of text as you like. And if you change your mind about a style later, like if you want everything that's red on the page to be green, all you have to do is actually go into the style sheet and change just that one line to change it to a different color, and following that, everything that's been set up to be styled with style 4 is going to change to that color. You don't have to individually go through all of your code and make those changes. That's something that the font tags simply can't do. If you had 50 words all formatted with a font tag to be red, you'd have to individually select all 50 words and change them to green or whatever color you wanted. So that's just a really quick example of the difference between font tag formatting and CSS formatting. And again, don't let this encourage you to skip this chapter because we're still going to cover some very useful things, and not all font-related tags have been deprecated in XHTML. I'm going to be showing you some perfectly valid and still up-to-date types of formatting for text, like creating numbered and bulleted lists. And again, all this stuff will be useful to you if you ever have to work on an older website that still uses standard HTML formatting. In the chapter on document basics, I mentioned that by default, Dreamweaver is set up to use CSS to handle all of the style changes that you might make to your web page, including changes to your page's background colors or text colors or link colors and so on. And I had you change a preference in that chapter to make sure that any changes that Dreamweaver made were actually done with HTML and not with CSS. So I just wanted to quickly add this movie in here in case you skipped over that chapter or didn't follow along with me there to show you where to find these preferences again. So if we go to Edit, Preferences, if you're on the Mac, it'll be Dreamweaver Preferences. Select the General category, and for this particular chapter, make sure Use CSS instead of HTML tags is not checked, because we don't want to use CSS in this chapter. If you have that checked and you're following along with me in the rest of these movies, you're going to see some menus on screen that you're not going to be able to find on your computer because you'll have this checked. Some of the formatting menus changed based on whether you have this option checked, so make sure, again, for these movies that you have it unchecked. And it's also important that you disable this feature before you start formatting text on your page. Otherwise, you're going to have to manually remove the CSS code and then add HTML formatting tags. And you definitely don't want to do that. And just so you know, you can change this on the fly. So if I have this set and I create a new page, I'll end up using HTML tags as format. But if I come back to Preferences and check it again and open yet another new page, that page will be formatted with CSS. The only thing I can't do is change this and have it automatically convert an HTML page to CSS. That I can't do. I have to do that manually. So again, let me just emphasize that for this chapter, make sure that you have Use CSS instead of HTML tags unchecked, and then click on OK. All right, let's talk about formatting text in Dreamweaver. First thing I want to do is define a new site because we're working in a new chapter and I have a new set of files to work with. Out here on my desktop, I copied the folder 07 Typography to the desktop, and it contains a couple of files we're going to be working with in this chapter. So if you have the exercise files, you can work along with me. All right, back in Dreamweaver, we're going to define that site. So let's see, this time I'm going to click the Dreamweaver Site button here in the Start page. And we'll just do Advanced because it's easier to work with. And we'll just call this one Typography. So we'll browse for the folder, go out to the desktop. And again, if you're on a Mac, you'll just single-click the folder and click Choose. If we're on Windows, we double-click it to open it, and then we can click Select. And we'll leave everything else the way it is and click on OK. All right, and there are the files that we're going to be working with. I'm going to double-click fonts.html to work with that one. All right, so let's talk about changing the size of text first. Now again, I need to mention that ultimately, you'll most likely want to do all of your size formatting as well as many other text formats with cascading style sheets. But as the saying goes, let's first learn to walk before we learn to author CSS-based web pages, or something like that. All right, in basic HTML, text size isn't expressed in points like it is in word processors. Instead, text size is expressed structurally. Essentially, this means that final text size is determined by each user's browser settings, meaning that even though you might specify a text size here in Dreamweaver, it might not be that exact size on the user's monitor. And this isn't actually a bad thing, because having text size expressed structurally ensures that your text will be readable no matter what the resolution of the user's monitor is set to. So let's take a look at how this works in Dreamweaver. The first thing you should get used to is that almost all of your text formatting is going to happen down here in the Properties Inspector. You can also use the Properties Inspector to examine what type of formatting has been applied to text by clicking your cursor in that text and then looking down here. So by default, when you type text into a Dreamweaver document, it appears at the default size, which is displayed here in the toolbar next to the size setting. And currently it's set to none. None simply means that there's no specified size, and that the text will appear in the user's browser at the browser's default setting. But what if I want to make the text larger or smaller? Well, just like in a word processor, the first thing I have to do is select the text that I want to change. For instance, this first phrase here. And then I can come down here to the Size menu and click the menu. Now, what you see here may look a little foreign to you if this is your first venture into web design. Notice that you don't see choices like 10 point, 12 point, 14 point, and so on, that you normally find in word processing programs. Outside of CSS, there really isn't a way to express point sizes on a web page. Instead, what you get are called relative font sizes. These sizes here are all relative to the default browser size, which happens to be 3. This default size is also known as the base font size. Notice that choosing 3 doesn't change the size of my text that I have selected here, because that's the default size setting. Kind of seems a bit arbitrary, but there you have it. The default size is 3. So with that in mind, I can go up to 2 increments smaller than 3 by choosing 2, you can see it got smaller there, or 1. And that's the smallest that I can get on a web page. I can go up to 4 sizes larger than 3 by choosing 4, 5, 6, or 7. And that's as large as I can get on a web page. Now, technically, this is known as absolute sizing because you're picking a specific number between 1 and 7, but it's still all relative to the default size of 3. So if 1 and 7 are my range of font sizes, what are all these numbers down here? I've got +1, +2, +3, all the way to +7, and -1, -2, -3, all the way to -7. This is what's really called relative font size. But to me, choosing 1 through 7 is just as relative as this method down here. Let's say I want a size equivalent to the relative size of 5. Well, first of all, I could just choose 5 like I just did, but I could also choose plus 2. Because 2 plus 3, the base font size, is 5. Notice that the size of the text didn't change between choosing plus 2 and 5. Just like choosing 7 is the same as choosing plus 4. Now, does this mean I can get the equivalent of a size 10 by choosing plus 7? Nope. It's pretty much still the exact same size as size 7. You can only have a range of 1 through 7 no matter whether you're using relative or absolute sizes. So essentially, plus 7, plus 6, plus 5, and plus 4 are all the same size. So why do they have plus 4, plus 5, plus 6, plus 7? Well, in HTML, you can actually specify a different base font size. So you might add a tag in HTML that you want your base font size to be, say, 4 instead of the default 3. So in that case, a plus 3 would actually give you a size of 7. But, I don't know why you would want to do something like that. So basically, you should just pick one of these two styles of sizing methods and just stick with it. So either use 1 through 7 or use the plus 1 through minus 7. Don't bother switching between the two. Just bear in mind that the size of your text will vary slightly based on things like the user's monitor resolution, their browser settings, and what platform they're on. For example, most Mac browsers display at 72 pixels per inch, while Windows machines display at 96 pixels per inch. Without getting into the technical reasons for this, just be aware that text tends to appear slightly larger on Windows machines than it does on Macs, which is why it's a good idea to test your pages on both platforms. But once again, you'll find out later that you can get a lot more control over your text size by using cascading style sheets. It's probably pretty apparent by now that I'm really pushing cascading style sheets, and it's not just because the CSS lobby keeps sending me exotic cars and cash kickbacks. I'm going to set this back to the default size of none, and we'll move on to the next movie. Now let's talk about changing the font face of text in Dreamweavers. Just like in a word processor, you change the font of text by first selecting it. So if I wanted to change this entire paragraph's font, I'd have to select the entire paragraph. If I want to change just this first sentence, I just select this first sentence. To change its font, I come down here to the Properties Inspector again, and I find the Font menu, which is right here, currently set to the default font. If I click this menu, I'll see several different fonts. Now, notice here that instead of listing a single font on each line, we have these font sets. Now, normally in a word processor, you have access to all the fonts installed on your computer, which can range from dozens of fonts to even hundreds of fonts. But the difference between working with fonts in a word processor and working with fonts in Dreamweaver is that in a word processor, your ultimate goal is usually to print the document out. So when you send the file to a printer connected to your computer, the printer can access the fonts you used and print everything the way you specified. Even when you send your pages out to be professionally printed, you often have to include the fonts along with your document on the disk that you send so that the printer can install them and print your documents out accurately. But when you're working with web pages, you have to choose fonts that are likely to be installed on the computer of the person who's viewing your web page. And as you can imagine, this significantly shortens the list of fonts that you can potentially use. You're not going to be able to select some obscure font that you found on a disk someplace. You're going to have to choose more common fonts like that most people are going to have on their computers, like the ones that are listed here. So I'll go ahead and choose a font face for my selected text. I'll go ahead and choose Verdana, and you can see that it's changed up here. I'm just going to switch over to the code view for a moment and look at what the code is written. So here's the text, and again, it's using a font tag, face, Verdana, Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. And all the text that appears between the opening font tag and the closing font tag has now been formatted as Verdana. Now you might be wondering why it's listing all these different fonts in here, because I wanted to specify Verdana, yet it's listing Verdana, Arial, Helvetica, and then Sans Serif. Well, as I just mentioned, when you're choosing a font face for text on a web page, you have to pick a font that most likely will be installed on the viewer's computer. What the font face does is it specifies a font set. So what's going to happen here is when somebody brings up this page in a web browser, the browser is first going to look on the computer to see if the font Verdana is installed. If it's not installed, it's going to look for Arial. Failing to find that, it'll look for Helvetica. If it doesn't find any of these three, it'll just use its default sans serif font. Sans serif basically means a font without the little flourishes, little decorations on the end of the letters. Like, for instance, what we're looking at here is a serif font. Let me go back to design. Like on the F here, you can sort of see a little line there, all these little things sticking out from the letters. Verdana, on the other hand, is just the letters without any kind of flourishes or decorations. It's sans serif. Sans being French for without serifs. And that's the only thing I remember from French class in high school. So that's an important thing to note about choosing fonts in web design. You're not choosing a single font, you're choosing a set of fonts and hoping that the user is going to have one of those fonts. So you can see that specifying a font doesn't really guarantee that your pages will look the same to all users. But by choosing from these sets down here, your pages stand a much better chance than if you were to choose some obscure font that's installed on your system. Each of Dreamweaver's font sets contain at least one font face that should be installed on either the Mac or Windows operating systems. For instance, the Verdana set. Any machine running a Microsoft product like Windows itself should have Verdana installed unless somebody purposely removed it. If you're running Microsoft Office or if you have Internet Explorer installed on your Mac, you also have Verdana. So Verdana is a good sans serif font to choose. In fact, Verdana was intentionally designed by Microsoft to look good on a computer screen, unlike, say, Helvetica, which was designed to look good when it's printed on paper. If you want to specify a serif set, choose the Georgia font set here. Again, Georgia was a serif font that was created to look good on screen, unlike, say, Times or Times New Roman, which were, again, originally created to look good on paper. Now, if you really want to specify a font other than what's listed in the font sets down here, Dreamweaver does give you the ability to create your own font sets. For instance, maybe your company uses a particular font for its logo, and the site you're building is only going to be viewed by people on company computers, and you know they all have that particular font installed. You can create your own font set by going down to the Edit Font List selection here, which opens up the Edit Font List window. And you can see here a list of all the different fonts sets that are currently available in Dreamweaver. Down here we have a listing of available fonts. And if I scroll through here, you'll see this is where you'll see the large list of all the fonts that are installed on your computer. So again, these fonts might not necessarily be on another user's computer, but if you know that they are, you can go ahead and create your own font set here. So if I wanted to come down here and choose something, let's go with Curls. That's such a nice looking font. And you could just choose one font if you wanted to, but if you did want to create a font set, all you have to do is select it, send the font over, select another font, send it over. And down here at the bottom, if you want to set up a default font, just in case they don't have any of these fonts that you've chosen here, you can choose a serif or a sans serif specification. And once you have them in here, if you want to get rid of one, you can always just send it back to the main list. But notice that this set has now been added to my font list. So if I click on OK, and I'll select some text. Now if I come up to the font list, you'll see we have Curls MT selected here. If I click on that, it does indeed display your text in that beautiful font. Let me just switch that back. So that's working with font sets. Oops, let me really switch that back. So that's working with font sets and how you can create your own font sets in Dreamweaver 8. Now let's move on to formatting our text with color. Once again, just like the other types of formats, size and font face, I need to select the text that I want to change. So if I wanted to change, say, this first phrase right here, I would select it. And just like before, to change the color of selected text, I need to come down to the Properties Inspector. And here you'll find an unmarked color well. Sometimes it's hard to see, but it's right there, and it's called Text Color. Just like the color well I showed you in Page Properties in the chapter on Document Basics, you can select the color with the eyedropper cursor from anywhere in this palette. So if I wanted to make this dark maroon color, select it. If I click off, you can see the color there. And just like that color well that I showed you in the Properties Inspector earlier, you're not limited to just these colors that are listed in here. Now sure, you have a wide range of different colors you can choose from, or even the system colors, but you can also use that eyedropper again to sample anywhere on screen that you like. So if I wanted to get the green from this Dreamweaver logo right here, I could click on that, And there it is. Of course, you can't see that too well against the white, so let me pick another color. Let's go with a dark blue. So it's just that easy. You just select the text, pick a color, and that's that. Now, one important thing you should know about selecting colors this way is that the color wheel in the Properties Inspector really should only be used for setting the color of short spans of text. I mean, that's the way it should be used. You should avoid doing things like selecting an entire paragraph and picking a color for it. Let me give you an example why by copying this paragraph. Let me just revert this file for simplicity's sake here. Now I'm going to take all this text, I'm just going to copy it, Control-C, hit return, I'm going to paste it there, paste it there, paste it there. Now if I come in here and I select all of this text here, and I make this all this dark maroon color. Let's look at the code view for a moment here. Notice that each time it has to write a font tag there and a font tag there. It also has to write a font tag here and a font tag here. So you want to avoid dragging to select all of your text. If you want all the text on your page to be one particular color, avoid doing that. So let's undo that. Instead, you should come up to your page properties. And in here, here's where you set the default color for text. So if in here I can just choose that one maroon color there, click on OK, I get the exact same effect. But if I go look at the code now, you can see that all it had to write was this line of code right here. Body text color equals this color. It didn't have to put a font tag, font tag, font tag, font tag all the way throughout the rest of this document. So it actually saved me a lot of unnecessary HTML code. So I've set the default color this way. Now if I wanted to come in here and change, say, just this line of text right here to a different color, I could come in, pick a color, like so, and there it is. So it only had to add the font tag just for that particular section, wherever it is, right there. Otherwise, the default color was specified right up here in the body tag. So just be aware of that pitfall. Don't ever come in here and select all your text and change the color down here. You're just adding a lot of unnecessary code. Oh, incidentally, while you're in here, if you want to just change everything back and take the color off that you selected, just click the default color button. And you can see that original blue text that I had changed has turned back to its original color. Same thing goes if I go back to page properties. I can set that back to its default color as well. One other thing I'll mention about color is, let me just make a couple different colors here. Doesn't really matter what. If you find that you're using particular colors all the time, and one of the things you should try to do is use consistent colors throughout your site. If I've set up a particular color scheme on one page that I like and I want to use those colors again, I don't need to come in here and jot down the colors that I've used or anything like that to try to remember which ones they are. If I go over to my Assets panel, I can go over to the Colors category. And in here, I'm just going to come down here and click the Refresh button. It's going to scan through my entire site and look for all the colors that I've used throughout my site. So once I'm in here, I can say, okay, that's the maroon color that I want to use. So once I select some other text, I can just come in here, drag that color right on top of that text that I've selected, and there it is. So that's a really useful feature. Right here in the Assets panel, you'll see a listing of all the colors you've used, their hexadecimal values, and you can just drag them right onto your selected text to apply them. You can also select text and select the color here and click the Apply button down here. And just like when we were talking about using images in the Assets panel, you can also set your favorite colors. So if there's a particular color that you use out of, say, dozens of colors in your site, you can select it, add it to your favorites, and then when you switch over to favorites, you'll find that color in there. So that's working with colors in Dreamweaver 8. All right, for this exercise, I'm going to close the fonts.html document we were working with earlier and go back to my Files panel, and I'm going to open up paragraph.html. And this is just a page with a lot of different samples of text on here. Now, in addition to formatting text that you have to first select before you can change, you can also apply the option in HTML to apply a format that affects an entire paragraph at once. To apply paragraph formatting, or as it's sometimes called block formatting, All you have to do is place your cursor somewhere in that paragraph or block of text. There's no need to select the entire thing. One important thing to note is that you can't combine paragraph formatting like you can with structural inline formatting, which is what we were doing when we were changing the color, the font, and the font face. For instance, while you can do things like select text, make it a certain size, make it a certain color, make it a certain font, and combine all those things together, you can't apply more than one paragraph format to a single paragraph. Paragraph formatting can be applied from this Format menu down here, and it includes several descriptive formats. Paragraph formatting also includes things like alignment, right here, and creating lists, which are these buttons down here, which we'll be getting to in just a little bit. So let's start with this Format menu over here. The first two choices here are None and Paragraph. Paragraph being the default selection. As you can see, as I click through these different paragraphs, it says Paragraph down here. All this means is that your text is always considered a regular paragraph unless you specify otherwise. If I just highlight some text in here, go to my code view, you can see that each paragraph has an opening p tag and a closing p tag. Everything in between those two tags is considered its own paragraph. There's one there, one there, one there, one there, and so on. So when would you ever want to select None? Well, one example I can call from my own experience is when I receive an email of text a client wants me to put on a website. Oftentimes, either because of the way they copied and pasted the text into their email program or because of the emailing process, the text comes all broken up into too many paragraphs, kind of like this first section of text up here. There's several different paragraphs here when it should only really be about 3 or 4 paragraphs tops. So to manually come in here and have to delete each one of these paragraphs would be a huge pain, especially if it's a really long chunk of text. It's much easier to just select it all, oops, not all of that, right to about there, and then just come in here from the Format menu and choose None. That collapses everything down into one chunk of text. And now I can come in here and decide where those paragraph breaks are actually supposed to go. So maybe one goes there, and one goes there. And those are going to be my 3 paragraphs. That was much easier than going in here and deleting all those paragraph breaks manually. So that's the reason why you might want to choose None, to collapse everything together, and then you can turn them back into paragraphs just by pressing the Enter or Return key at appropriate places, and you can see that they're all set to paragraph again now. So selecting None can be useful if you ever paste in some text that has a lot of unnecessary paragraph breaks. You can quickly strip them all out by selecting all the text, choosing None, and from there you can add back just the necessary breaks. But you'll probably find yourself using these heading formats more often. You'll notice there are 6 levels of headings, heading 1 through heading 6, and each one indicates to the browser the relative importance of the formatted text. So here in these paragraphs, if I put my cursor in one of them and select, say, actually, let's use these here since I created these. Here I have some paragraphs, and they're each representing heading 1 through heading 6. If I put my cursor in heading 1 and select heading 1, notice I didn't have to highlight the whole thing, I just put my cursor in it someplace. You'll see that that particular paragraph has become big and bold. That's the usual appearance of text that's been formatted as a heading. Each subsequent level, contrary to their numbering system, gets a little bit smaller. There's heading 2, heading 3, 4, and so on. But each one still stands out by being big and bold. As I work my way down here, the headings actually start getting a little smaller than regular default font size, but it still remains bold, and most browsers generally add a little bit more space above and below header text to set it apart from other text. Now, the default appearance of text that's been formatted as a heading might not look that attractive, but you'll find later on that it's a pretty common practice to use heading tags when you want to apply cascading style sheets to your pages. And we'll see that when we get into the chapter on style sheets. The last type of format that's found in this menu is called pre-formatted. Now, normally in HTML, you're not allowed to have multiple spaces between words on a line, like I showed you earlier. If I wanted to put more space between large and 1499, I can't do it. I can hit the spacebar as much as I want and nothing's going to happen. HTML doesn't recognize more than one space, even if it's spaces that appear in the source code. Only one space is registered between characters on the same line. Now, this is a big bummer for people who have gotten used to making columns of text in their word processors by repeatedly pressing the spacebar over and over again when they really should be using tab stops, but that's another story. Now, to create the appearance of columns in HTML, you should really be working with tables or CSS or both. But the pre-formatted paragraph format does let you cheat this rule. This format tells the browser to reproduce the text exactly as it appears in the HTML, including all spaces. So if I switch this line to paragraph, if I switch this line to pre-formatted, notice in here I can come in, and the reason they all change is because they're all considered part of the same paragraph. I can just come in and add as many spaces as I like. Another characteristic of the pre-formatted tag is that it changes the font into a monospaced font, which is a font in which all the characters are the same width. Which isn't to say you can't select the pre-formatted text and apply a different font face, but having a monospaced pre-formatted font can make it really easy for you to line up text with each other. For instance, with this all set to pre-formatted, let me just come into medium, hit the backspace a couple times. Now, because they're all the same width and I can add as many spaces as I like, I can line text up really easily with a monospaced font, just by adding spaces like so. So I could come in here and change that pre-formatted font to Verdana, but notice that Verdana is not a monospaced font, so things don't line up as well. Fonts like Courier are monospaced fonts, and you can see everything lines up nicely. So that's the pre-formatted option from this menu, and that's pretty much it for the format menu. Next we have the alignment buttons, which I really shouldn't have to talk about too much because we already looked at them, but if I just put my cursor in this paragraph up here, I can left align, which it is by default, center, and right. We also have the justify option, which keeps everything equal to the left and to the right. You can see it's lined up to the left and right instead of having a jagged edge like it does up here. So those are your alignment options. And lastly, we have what are called lists. Let me scroll down a little bit here. Here I have a list of items, and each item is considered a separate paragraph because I pressed enter after each one of these items when I entered the text. So it's really easy to create numbered or bulleted lists in Dreamweaver. All I have to do is select the items that I want to be in that list, and then come down here to the Properties Inspector and select either Ordered List, which is a numbered list, as you can see there, or Unordered List, which is a bulleted list. So you can see just by clicking back and forth between those two, I can change those. I can even create sublists. If I select this list of breads here, I can make that into a bulleted list, but if I wanted to select types of whole wheat bread, I can move them in using the text indent button here, and I can make that a numbered list if I wanted to. So you can combine your different types of lists, like so. The only thing you have to be concerned about is that each item on your list should be its own paragraph when you start, otherwise you won't be able to break them into nice lists like that. They'll start combining together. And finally, other than the numbered lists and unnumbered lists, you can also create what are called definition lists. And these can be useful on frequently asked question pages or glossary pages and things like that. So here I have a list of terms and their definitions. And again, these are each their own separate paragraphs. So if I come in here and I highlight all the terms and their definitions, notice it alternates term, definition, term, definition, term, definition. You're not going to find a button for the definition list down here. You're going to find it up here under the text menu. If you go to list, you'll see definition list right here. So you can see what it did here is it, first of all, moved all the text together, so there's not a lot of space between the terms and the definitions, and it indented the definition so you can easily tell which one's a term and which one is a definition. So there you have several different types of paragraph formats. Remember that you can apply only a single paragraph format to any paragraph, but you can apply inline structural formatting to any selected text within those paragraphs. So again, if I wanted to change the color or font or size of any of these, I could just select them and apply them down here. And one last thing I'll mention about formatting text. If you're finding it tedious to have to select text and then come down here to all these various menus, you'll be happy to know that you can also right-click on selected text or in a paragraph And from this contextual menu, you'll be able to select different headings, paragraph formats, list formats, alignment, font settings, style, CSS styles, and sizes, all right from here. So you don't always have to come down to your property inspector. And again, if you're on a Mac with a single button mouse, you can control-click to bring up this menu as well. I'm going to go ahead and close the paragraph.html file I was working with in the last movie, and I'm going to open up tableformat.html. And in this movie, I just want to very quickly point out something that should be obvious to most people, but you'll be surprised how many people don't realize this, is when you're working with a table, and we will be getting into tables in just a little bit, if you want to apply formatting to text that appears inside table cells, you can still select the text and change everything down here, just like we were looking at before. If I wanted to make it slightly smaller or change its color or what have you, I'm going to do that. I can do that one at a time in each of these table cells. But if I want to format a lot of text to look exactly the same, I can simply click in one cell, drag through to the adjoining cells, and with them all selected like this, I can quickly format them all like so. And even pick a color for them. A good color for them. So that's really all I wanted to show you here, is that you can drag through table cells and format the text in your tables that way. You can see if I look through here, it actually adds all the necessary font tags to each one of those cells. There's a font color tag right up there, font color, font face, all these different things here. And just be glad you don't have to enter it in the code yourself manually. So again, if you just want to format some regular text on its own inside of a table cell, it's just like regular text that's outside of a table cell. You can do whatever you want to it just down here. But again, if you want to format multiple cells, just drag through them and apply your formats. And that's all I have to say about that. I mentioned in the chapter on choosing font faces for your text that you're pretty much limited in Dreamweaver to selecting fonts that are likely to appear on the person who's viewing your site's computer. If you choose some weird obscure font, they most likely won't have access to that font, and the browser will just default to whatever the default system font happens to be. But there is a sort of solution available in Dreamweaver that I want to point out in this one, and it's something called flash text. This allows you to insert a flash object, and it's hard to get very far in web design these days without hearing the term flash. This allows you to insert this flash text into your document. That way, anybody who has the Flash plugin installed on their browser, and these days, that's just about everybody, they'll be able to see the text in exactly the font that you intend it to be seen in. Now, I wouldn't suggest using this plugin for paragraphs of text. This is really useful for headings or section markers, things like that. Just don't make several paragraphs this way. So let me give you an example. Let me get rid of this T-Cloud Locations heading here and delete that. And if you come up here under the Common section of the insert bar, if we come over here to the Media section, you'll see we have Flash, Flash Button, all sorts of different Flash options in here. The one I want here is Flash Text. That'll open up the Flash Text window here. And first thing I can do is insert the text that I want to have appear up here. And you can see it appears in the font that's listed up here. And when I click this menu, I have access to all of my system fonts, all the fonts that are installed on my system. So I can come in here and just start playing around and decide which one I want to use. Don't like that one. All right, we'll just go with that one. Now, notice in here we can also do things like making it bold, italicized, setting its alignment, setting its size, select a color for it. Let's go ahead and make that bold. We can also set a rollover color if we want the color of the text to change when we move our mouse over it, as well as turn this flash text into a link. So if somebody were to actually click on this flash text, we could have it linked to another page on our site. I'm not going to bother turning it into a link right now because I don't need this heading to be a link, but just be aware that you can do that. Now what this is going to do is it's going to generate an SWF file, a SWF file. This is going to be the flash file that you'll actually have in your site, and it's going to generate it for you. So I'm going to give it a less generic name. Just call it locations.swif. And you want to browse to make sure you save this in a proper location. Don't just stick it right in your main root folder. I'm going to go in and save this in my images folder. And again, I'll just call this locations.swif. So you can see now it's being saved in the images folder. It's called locations.swif. Click on OK. It's just going to take a moment to generate that flash file. The accessibility attributes come up, so I'll just give this a quick title, the cloud locations. Click on OK. And there's my flash text. If I view this in my browser, you can see it appears in that exact font. The nice thing about working with flash text is I can come in here and resize it if I want to, and it's going to continue to look just as good. Or if I want to change it even more, I can just double click to go back in here. And if I wanted to make a rollover color, I could do that. Change the font. Could do that. Click on OK, and it's just going to regenerate that SWIFT file to my new settings, and there it is. So now if I view this in my browser, there's that rollover color you can see right there. So again, this can be a viable solution if you really need to use a particular font on your web page that you know most people are not going to have installed. You can just come in, use the built-in flash text button up here, and create your text. And again, this does require that the user has the Flash browser installed. Most people do have it installed these days. If not, you can provide a link to Macromedia where they can download the Flash plugin for their browser.